Medevac is waving off, too hot. Displacing to Firebase Viper. Follow on mission at first light. The radio crackled with her platoon leader's voice. Staff Sergeant Rhea Coulson lay behind a crumbling mud wall in the Karengal Valley, her left leg shattered below the knee, tourniquet screaming, vision tunneling from blood loss. Through the haze of pain, she'd just heard Lieutenant Drake, the man she'd trusted with her life for 8 months, order the platoon to pull back and leave her alone in Taliban-controlled territory until morning. Around her, the valley was silent except for the distant sound of boots on rock fading into the Afghan night. Her radio still worked, her weapon still worked, and somewhere in the mountains, she knew there were people hunting her. What her platoon didn't know was that Rhea Coulson wasn't just another staff sergeant. She was the daughter of Command Sergeant Major William Coulson, the most decorated NCO in Ranger history, a man who'd spent 30 years teaching soldiers that you never ever leave anyone behind. And she'd just been abandoned by the people who wore the same flag on their shoulders. The Karengal Valley, Afghanistan, 2021, the graveyard of ambitions, a place where mountains rose like broken teeth and every shadow held the promise of violence. The air was thin, dust-choked, and carried the smell of cordite and fear. It was 22:30 hours, and Firebase Viper 3 kilometers to the south was the closest thing to safety, but it might as well have been on another planet. Staff Sergeant Rhea Coulson, 27 years old, lay in the dirt with her back against a mud brick wall that had probably stood for 100 years. She was 5'7", lean and hard from years of rucking through mountains, with auburn hair matted to her skull under her helmet and green eyes that had gone glassy with shock. Her left leg was destroyed. Shrapnel from an RPG had torn through her calf and shattered her tibia. She'd applied the tourniquet herself, cranked it down until the bleeding stopped, and then radioed for extraction. That was 20 minutes ago. Now she was alone. Her squad, Bravo Company Sen Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, had been ambushed during a patrol sweep targeting a Taliban supply route. The firefight had been brutal and chaotic. RPGs, machine gun fire, grenades bouncing off rocks. When the dust settled, 3 Rangers were wounded and Rhea was the worst. Her platoon leader, First Lieutenant Mason Drake, had called for an urgent surgical medevac. The bird had been inbound when Taliban fighters opened up with a Dash-K heavy machine gun from the ridgeline, forcing the helicopter to wave off. Drake had made the call. His voice over the radio had been strained, almost breaking. They couldn't get the bird back in until they suppressed the enemy gun position, but his squad was down to half strength and couldn't stay pinned. The platoon would displace to Firebase Viper and coordinate a rescue at first light with proper air support. Rhea would have to hold her position and wait. Except she could hear it in his voice. He didn't think she'd make it that long. Rhea shifted her weight and felt the jagged end of her broken tibia grind against torn muscle. The pain was a living thing, white-hot and relentless, but she forced it down into a corner of her mind where it couldn't touch her. Her father had taught her that pain was just information, and right now the information was simple. She was alone, immobile and surrounded by hostiles who would be searching for survivors. She checked her rifle, an M4 carbine with 4 magazines left. She checked her radio, still functional, tuned to the emergency frequency. And she checked her resolve. She wasn't going to die here, not like this. Rhea Coulson had grown up on army bases from Georgia to Germany, the daughter of a man who'd become a living legend in the Ranger community. Command Sergeant Major William Coulson had been among the founding cadre of the modern 75th Ranger Regiment, a man who deployed to Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd earned 2 silver stars, a bronze star with Valor, and the respect of every soldier who'd ever served under him. He'd also taught Rhea that legacy was a double-edged sword. When she was 16, her father had been severely wounded in Fallujah, shrapnel through the chest, collapsed lung, 3 minutes of combat life-saving that brought him back from clinical death. He'd survived, but he'd come home different, quieter, haunted by the faces of men he'd lost. One night, sitting on the back porch of their quarters at Fort Benning, he'd told Rhea something she'd never forgotten. The worst thing that could happen to a soldier wasn't dying, was being left behind by the people you trusted. He'd told her about Somalia 1993, about soldiers cut off and surrounded, fighting for hours while reinforcements struggled to reach them. He'd told her that the Ranger creed, "I will never leave a fallen comrade," wasn't just words. It was the difference between being a soldier and being something less than human. Rhea had enlisted at 22, 2 years after graduating from the University of North Carolina with a degree in biology. She hadn't told her father she was joining the army until after she'd signed the contract. When he found out, he didn't celebrate. He just asked her one question: why Rangers? She told him the truth. She wanted to be part of something that mattered. She wanted to earn her place, not inherit it. Her father had nodded once and told her the same thing he'd told every new private under his command: the only easy day was yesterday, and respect was earned in inches, not miles. Rhea had passed RASP, Ranger Assessment and Selection Program. On her first attempt, one of only 3 women in her class to make it through. She'd deployed twice to Iraq and once to Afghanistan, earning her sergeant stripes and then staff sergeant through a combination of competence, endurance, and an almost pathological refusal to quit. She'd led fire teams, trained new Rangers, and survived more firefights than most soldiers saw in a career. Her call sign among her squad was Reaper, given to her after a mission in Ramadi where she'd held a rooftop position for 6 hours under constant sniper fire, methodically picking off insurgents who thought they could overrun her position. She hadn't killed because she enjoyed it. She'd killed because her team was depending on her, and failure wasn't an option. Now, lying in the dirt with her leg destroyed and her platoon gone, she thought about her father's words. The worst thing wasn't dying, it was being left behind. Lieutenant Drake hadn't wanted to leave her. She'd heard the agony in his voice over the radio. He'd made a tactical decision, weighed the risk against the reward, and decided the squad couldn't hold position long enough for a rescue under fire. And maybe he was right. But her father would have found another way. Her father would have walked through hell to bring her home. Rhea keyed her radio and transmitted on the emergency frequency, her words clipped and professional despite the morphine haze. She identified herself, gave encrypted grid coordinates using brevity codes, and requested immediate extraction. Then she waited. And in the darkness, someone was listening. 8 kilometers to the northeast, a Marine Special Operations team from 2nd Marine Raider Battalion was operating in the high mountains, conducting surveillance on a suspected Taliban commander's compound. The team, call sign Titan, consisted of 6 Marines led by Gunnery Sergeant Ilyas Thorne, a hard-edged operator with 15 years in special operations and a reputation for bringing his men home alive. Thorne's radio operator, Corporal Ben Asher, picked up Rhea's transmission. It was faint, broken by static, but unmistakable. A Ranger squad leader in contact, wounded, requesting extraction. Asher immediately passed the information to Thorne. Thorne listened to the transmission twice, then checked his map. The grid coordinates put the Ranger 8 kilometers southwest of their position, deep in the valley where Taliban activity was concentrated. He radioed back to his command, Marine Special Operations Command Forward Operating Base at Bagram, and requested clearance to divert for a rescue operation. The response came back in 5 minutes, and it wasn't what Thorne wanted to hear. Higher command denied the request. They told him that Bravo Company had already displaced, and that a follow-on mission was being planned for First Light with proper air and ground support. Thorne's team was ordered to continue their surveillance mission and avoid compromising their position. The Taliban commander they were tracking was a high-value target, and they'd been hunting him for 3 weeks. Thorne stared at the radio for a long moment. Then he looked at his team, 6 Marines who'd been with him through Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Men who understood that the only thing separating them from the enemy wasn't firepower or technology. It was the promise that if they went down, someone would come for them. He told his team they had a choice to make. They could follow orders and stay on mission, let the Ranger wait for First Light and hope the Taliban didn't find her first, or they could go off book and extract her themselves. It would mean abandoning their surveillance operation, letting a high-value target slip away after weeks of work. It would mean crossing 8 kilometers of hostile terrain in the dark without air support or quick reaction force backup. It would mean courts-martial if things went wrong, ended careers if they went right. The team was silent for 10 seconds. Corporal Asher spoke first, his voice flat. "If it was one of us down there, what would you want them to do, Gunny?" Corporal Mattis, the team's point man, nodded. "We didn't join to let people die because some desk jockey thinks the math doesn't work." Lance Corporal Chen, their medic, was already packing his aid bag. "Rangers would come for us." The other 3 Marines, Rodriguez, Patterson, and Webb, didn't say anything. They just started checking their gear. Thorne keyed his radio back to command. His voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. Titan Actual experiencing intermittent comms issues. Going dark to troubleshoot. Will re-establish contact at First Light. Out. Then he shut down the radio, shouldered his pack, and looked at his team. He didn't thank them. Didn't give them a speech about honor or duty. He just told them the truth. They had 8 kilometers to cover, and maybe 90 minutes before Taliban search parties found the wounded Ranger. They'd move fast, light, and quiet. If they got compromised, they'd fight their way out or die trying. No one argued, no one hesitated. They moved out into the darkness, leaving their surveillance position behind. The Taliban commander they'd been hunting would escape. Their careers would be investigated, possibly ended. But somewhere in the valley, a Ranger was waiting for someone to remember that the creed meant something. And 6 Marines had just decided it meant everything. The morphine made time feel wrong. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was the other way around. Rhea's mind drifted between the present, the pain, the darkness, the cold, and the past. She thought about her father, about the last conversation they'd had before this deployment. He'd driven her to Pope Field, helped her load her gear onto the bus, and then pulled her aside. He hadn't said much. He'd just looked at her with those hard, tired eyes and told her to remember that being a ranger wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing the right thing when everyone else had given up. She'd hugged him, told him she loved him, and promised she'd come home. Now, lying in the dirt with her leg destroyed and her squad gone, she wondered if she'd lied to him. Her radio hissed with static. She keyed the mic and transmitted again, slower this time, fighting through the morphine fog. She gave her call sign, Reaper 2-6, encrypted coordinates, and a Setrep 1 friendly, squad leader, immobile, urgent surgical, heavy bleeding controlled, no enemy contact yet. She transmitted twice, then went silent to conserve battery. The night pressed down on her. The stars overhead were impossibly bright, indifferent. She thought about the men in her squad, the rangers she'd trained with, deployed with, trusted. They'd left her. Not because they didn't care, but because Lieutenant Drake had made a decision she understood even as it tore her apart. She thought about Drake. He was 26, a West Point graduate on his first deployment, smart and capable but still learning what it meant to lead men in combat. She'd heard the anguish in his voice when he'd given the order to displace. He'd made the call he thought would save the most lives. And maybe he was right. Maybe in his position she would have done the same thing. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. Her father had once told her that the hardest part of command wasn't making life or death decisions. It was living with them afterward. Drake would have to live with this. And maybe, if she survived, she'd tell him it was okay, that she understood, that he'd made the call he thought was right. But tonight, alone in the darkness with hostile forces closing in, she didn't feel forgiving. She felt abandoned, and that abandonment burned hotter than the pain in her leg. Rhea closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not to God but to whoever was listening. She asked for one more hour, one more chance, one more fight. And in the mountains, 6 Marines heard her second transmission and started running faster. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne and his team moved through the mountains like ghosts, fast, silent, efficient. They covered the first 6 kilometers in 70 minutes, using night vision to navigate rocky terrain and avoid Taliban patrol routes. The last 2 kilometers were slower, more cautious. Thorne's point man, Corporal Mattis, spotted the compound from 400 meters out and signaled a halt. Thorne used his thermal optic to scan the area. He spotted Rhea immediately, a single heat signature behind the mud wall, stationary, weapon oriented toward likely enemy approaches, professional. He also spotted 4 heat signatures moving through the village 200 meters to the east. Taliban fighters, likely a search party looking for survivors from the earlier ambush. Thorne made a quick decision. His team would split into 2 elements, Mattis, Rodriguez, Patterson, and Webb would establish a security perimeter at 100 meters and engage the Taliban if they approached. Thorne and Corporal Chen, their medic, would move directly to the ranger's position and prepare her for extraction. They moved in fast. Thorne reached the compound wall and called out in a low voice, identifying himself as friendly U.S. Marines and telling the ranger not to shoot. Rhea's voice came back, weak but steady. She told him she was behind the north wall, immobile, urgent, surgical. Thorne rounded the corner and saw her. She was in bad shape, pale, sweating, her uniform soaked with blood despite the tourniquet. But her eyes were clear and her rifle was up, oriented on her sector. She'd held her position for over an hour alone, knowing she might die. Thorne had seen a lot of soldiers in his career, but this one had something different. She had her father's eyes. Thorne knelt beside her and introduced himself. He told her his team was going to get her out, but they had to move fast. Taliban fighters were 200 meters out and closing. Rhea nodded, her words slurred from morphine. She asked if he had a litter. Thorne shook his head. They'd moved light for speed. They'd have to carry her. Chen moved in with his medical pack and assessed Rhea's leg. The tourniquet had held, but she'd lost significant blood. He started a second IV line, pushed tranexamic acid to prevent clotting failure, gave her a controlled dose of ketamine for pain management, and splinted the broken leg as best he could with the materials they had. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold for the movement. Thorne radioed his security element and got a Setrep. Taliban fighters had split into 2 groups. One group was moving toward the compound. The other was circling north, likely trying to cut off any escape route. Thorne had maybe 8 minutes before they were surrounded. He told Rhea they were going to move now. She'd ride on his back in a modified fireman's carry with Chen providing rear security. She started to protest about her rifle. Thorne told her to sling it across her chest. If things went sideways, she'd need it. They moved out. Thorne carried Rhea's weight, 135 pounds plus gear, without complaint, moving at a fast walk through the darkness. Chen followed, scanning their 6 with his rifle up. Behind them, the sound of voices grew louder. The Taliban had found the compound. Thorne's security element engaged. The crack of rifle fire echoed through the valley, sharp and immediate. Thorne didn't stop. He kept moving, trusting his Marines to hold the line long enough for him to get the ranger clear. Rhea, barely conscious from blood loss and medication, kept her rifle pointed over Thorne's shoulder, forcing herself to scan for threats even as her vision tunneled. They covered 300 meters in 6 minutes. Thorne radioed his team and told them to break contact and fall back to the rally point. The Marines disengaged in pairs, using suppressive fire and grenades to cover their withdrawal. 1 minute later, the entire team was together, moving fast through the rocks toward the extraction point Thorne had designated on the map. Rhea's vision was fading. She could hear the Marines around her, could feel Thorne's steady breathing as he carried her, but everything else was slipping away. She keyed her radio one last time and transmitted a message to anyone listening. She said her call sign, her status, and 2 words, "still fighting." And somewhere at Firebase Viper, Lieutenant Drake heard the transmission and broke down. Thorne's team reached the extraction point, a flat stretch of rocky ground 500 meters from the compound, and immediately set up a defensive perimeter. Thorne laid Rhea down gently, checked her vitals with Chen, and radioed for medevac. He used the team's encrypted tactical SATSIAM to send a priority message directly to Marine Special Operations Command at Bagram. Marine Raider Team Titan declaring tactical emergency, 1 critical Army casualty, urgent surgical evacuation required, grid coordinates attached, hostile forces in pursuit, request immediate air support. The response came back in 3 minutes. An Army H-60 Black medevac was inbound from Bagram, ETA 18 minutes, with Apache escort for suppression. But higher command was already demanding an explanation for why Titan had abandoned their surveillance mission and violated direct orders. Thorne told them the explanation could wait until after he got his casualty on the bird. Then he switched frequencies. 18 minutes felt like 18 hours. Rhea drifted in and out of consciousness, her body shutting down from blood loss and shock. Thorne and Chen worked on her continuously, monitoring the tourniquet, checking her pulse, adjusting the IV flow, keeping her airway clear. The rest of the team held security, scanning the darkness for Taliban fighters who were still searching for them. At minute 12, they heard engines. 2 Taliban pickup trucks with mounted PKM machine guns were racing toward their position from the village, spotlights cutting through the darkness. Thorne's team opened fire, methodical and precise. The first truck's windshield exploded. The second swerved and crashed into a boulder. Fighters spilled out, taking cover, returning fire. Green tracers asked through the darkness. At minute 15, they heard the rotors. The Black Hawk came in low and fast, its Apache escort already engaging Taliban positions with 30 mm cannon fire. The medevac pilot brought the bird down hard, crew chief dropping the ramp before the wheels even touched ground. Thorne and Chen moved Rhea aboard, laying her on the litter and strapping her down. Thorne climbed in with her, yelling at his team to follow. The 5 other Marines bounded aboard, still firing, as the pilot pulled pitch. The helicopter lifted off just as Taliban fighters emerged from the rocks 75 meters away. Green tracers reached for the Black Hawk but fell short, the Apache's suppressive fire keeping their heads down. Thorne watched the valley disappear below them and allowed himself one breath of relief. Rhea opened her eyes and looked at him. Her voice was barely a whisper, words slurred. She asked who he was. Thorne told her his name and rank. Then she asked why he'd come for her when her own platoon hadn't. Thorne looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her the truth. He said he'd come because leaving people behind wasn't something he could live with. Not for any mission. Not for any reason. Rhea's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She thanked him. Then she asked him to make sure someone told her father she'd held her position and hadn't quit. Thorne nodded and told her she could tell him herself. The helicopter landed at Bagram's trauma center 14 minutes later. Combat surgeons rushed Rhea into the operating room, where a team of doctors worked for 7 hours to save her leg. The tibia was shattered in multiple places and required surgical reconstruction with plates and rods, but they saved the limb. 4 days later, Rhea woke up in a hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany. The first person she saw was her father. Command Sergeant Major William Coulson had flown from Fort Benning the moment he'd received the casualty notification. He stood beside her bed, his face carved from stone, his eyes red. He told her he was proud of her. He told her she'd done everything right. And then he told her that Gunnery Sergeant Thorne and his team were under investigation for disobeying orders, and that he was going to make sure they got medals instead of courts-martial, even if he had to call every general officer he'd ever served with. Rhea closed her eyes and thought about Drake. She didn't know what would happen to him, didn't know if the investigation would end his career or give him a chance to learn from this. She just felt tired. Her father squeezed her hand and told her to rest. The fight was over. She'd made it home. 8 months later, Rhea stood on the parade field at Fort Benning, leaning on a cane, watching the 75th Ranger Regiment conduct a change of command ceremony. Her leg had healed enough to walk, but the doctors had told her she'd never pass a Ranger physical fitness test again. Her combat career was over. She'd been awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and was pending a Bronze Star with valor for her actions in the Karengal. Though the paperwork was still grinding through the system, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne and his team had received Navy Commendation Medals with valor for the rescue operation after a tense investigation concluded they'd made the right call, even if they'd violated orders to do it. First Lieutenant Drake had received a career-altering letter of reprimand after the investigation found he'd made tactical errors in planning the extraction and failed to maintain adequate suppressive fire on the enemy gun position. He'd been reassigned to a staff position at the Maneuver Center of Excellence, where he'd spend the next 2 years learning what failure cost before anyone gave him another platoon. None of it felt like justice. It just felt like the Army had processed another incident and moved on. Ria's father stood beside her, his uniform crisp, his bearing perfect. He'd retired 3 months earlier after 32 years of service. He told Ria she had a choice now. She could medically retire, take her pension, and build a life outside the Army. Or she could stay in and find a new way to serve. Ria thought about the night in the valley, about lying in the dirt alone, listening to the sound of Drake's anguished voice over the radio, about Gunnery Sergeant Thorne and 6 Marines who'd risked everything to bring her home, about the promise her father had made to every soldier he'd ever led: no one gets left behind. She told her father she wanted to stay. Not in the Rangers. She couldn't pass the physical standards anymore. But somewhere she could teach the next generation of soldiers what it meant to lead, what it meant to keep promises when everything was on the line. Her father nodded and told her there was a position open at the Ranger Training Brigade. Instructor Kadar, teaching RASP students about leadership, small unit tactics, and the one rule that mattered more than anything else: you never leave a fallen comrade. Ria accepted the position. 3 months later, she stood in front of a class of Ranger candidates and told them a story about a night in the Karengal Valley when she'd been wounded and alone, and saved by Marines who understood what the uniform really meant. She told them that legacy wasn't inherited. It was earned. And the only way to earn it was to be the person who came back when everyone else had given up. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. Now she was going to make sure no one else had to.